All right, good morning, everybody. It is good to be with you all. My name is Caleb, and I'm one of the pastors here. And if we haven't met yet, I'd love to meet you guys after the service. Parents, thank you for driving down. It is great that you could be here with us today and join us in celebrating Jesus' resurrection here, right? As it is Resurrection Sunday or Easter Sunday, depending on your persuasion there. And yeah, that's what we're going to talk about, right? We're going to talk about Jesus' resurrection. Probably no surprise there, it being Easter and all that. Yeah, you get excited about it. Let's go, Yeah. Yeah. All right. That's it. That's exciting stuff, right? And as we think about Jesus' resurrection, right, I want us to think about how we see the world sometimes, not necessarily in like a philosophical, worldview type of sense. Some of us may tend to gravitate towards that, but physically, how do you see the world, right? Some of us, we have limited perspectives. If we were to look at a piece of art or something like a painting, we have one view of it, and then another person has a completely different perspective on it. And sometimes that's just due to biases, how you've been educated in art and things like that. But sometimes physically you could not see the same thing because you are colorblind or something like that, right? So you don't see the full spectrum of color. You can't see the full picture. You're limited in your ability to see what can be done, right? And what they've done now, though, is they have this new technology, right? With these glasses you can put on, and then people who are born colorblind can then see the full spectrum of color for the very first time. It's a very cool thing that they've invented, and this went viral the past maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and there's a bunch of videos of people's first reaction to seeing color, okay? And we actually have a short video of that today, so let's go ahead and watch that.
I'm 65 years old. I have gone 65 years without seeing color. I've seen these videos where people get emotional. I am not going to get emotional.
That's okay.
Right.
1, 2, 3.
All right. So what do you have to do? It takes time to adjust. It says.
Amen.
It's totally different.
Yeah, isn't that heartwarming, And maybe some of us got misties, as my wife would say, from that video, right? It's truly amazing to see his reaction when he sees that full spectrum of color for the very first time, right? It's a visceral reaction. It's emotional. It's powerful for him. And we see also in this viral moment in social media when people were sharing this with other people, right? This was a powerful enough thing. They wanted to share it with others because it was good news that they could see the change that had happened. Like, man, I can now see, even as silly as it is, like these little balls in this pit with all these different colors for the first time, right? It's powerful. It's emotional. And I think this is what can happen for us spiritually as well, right? That we're not born in a state where we can fully see the picture of who God is. We can't see fully who Jesus is, right? We have that limitation that we don't see the full picture. Okay, and then we need a change in us. We need God to show us the full picture of who he is. And what we're going to see today is people seeing the full picture of who Jesus is and what he has done for the very first time. And that's what we're going to focus on today as we jump into Luke chapter 24. So, all right, we're going to close out our series in Luke chapter 24. And I believe if you're using the Bibles that are in the buckets, it's page 516 if you want to flip there. So page 516 will be in Luke chapter 24. All right, and it'll also come up on the screen as well. So Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 1, Luke says this, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping in and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. And we'll pause there. And so this is our first section we're going to be looking at today, and you could almost give it the subhead of the women and the empty tomb. And that's because really what we see is these ladies go into the tomb and they find Jesus not there. And Luke sets this up by saying this happens on the first day of the week. That's something we might not think is that significant at first glance, but that means it's Sunday, okay? And you might be wondering, why do we meet on Sundays at church? Well, it's because Jesus resurrected on a Sunday. And so the early church said, in order to celebrate that every week, we will now start meeting on Sunday instead of Saturday, as was the Jewish tradition. Because the Jewish people would meet, or their Sabbath would be from Friday night to Saturday night. And that was their day of rest, their day to gather in the synagogue and things like that. That's when that would happen. But the early church, in order to celebrate Jesus' resurrection, changed the days. And so this is one of the places where this comes from in the Bible. And so we see on this Sunday, the women have appropriately rested as was under the law. And then they go to treat Jesus' body with these spices and oils as was tradition. And so it's going about a regular rhythm of life, that when someone died, this is what they would do. This is something normal for when people die. But then they get there and they say, man, the stone's gone. And then they get even further and then they say, oh, Jesus' body gone. And now there's two guys here, right? And so if you or I were to go to one of our friends' gravestones and there was a giant hole there and the casket was open and there's no body, we'd probably be pretty shocked too, right? It's something that's spectacular, something that's crazy, something that's surprising for us, not a normal everyday experience. And then you add on top of that there's two guys there, right? Two people you're not expecting to see there are there. And these two guys have what's translated here as dazzling clothing. I don't know about you, but I don't tend to use the word dazzling very often, right? It's not something probably in your everyday vocabulary. But really the idea Luke is painting here is it's the language similar to a flash of lightning, that it is bright, it is powerful. That is the vision of this clothing that these guys have on here. And so what Luke is pointing at here is that these men are angels, okay? And so we see that in the clothing, and we also see that in the women's reaction, right? They're scared, they're afraid, they show respect to these men. And this is the stereotypical response of people in the Bible when they see angels. They're afraid, they show some sign of respect, there's some sort of, sometimes bright light like is in the dazzling apparel. And so this is traditionally what happens when people see angels for the first time. They're very afraid. And so we see that it's not just men, but these angels then have a message for these ladies. And so as they enter into the tomb and talk to these guys, they say, hey, you shouldn't be surprised. You shouldn't be shocked by this because Jesus told you this was going to happen. This is the plan. Okay? You should know about this thing, right? You should know Jesus was going to do this. And if you look at just Luke alone, you don't look at Matthew, Mark, or John, and you just look at Luke, at least 5 times Luke tells us that Jesus taught that he would have to suffer at the hands of authorities. And out of those 5, at least 2 times, he says that he explicitly must die and then rise again. So even if you just look at Luke in an isolated case, it's clear that Jesus taught this in his ministry, that he taught this from the beginning, and that if they paid close attention, this is what they should know about him. And so on the one hand, we know that, hey, this is something they should have known. But on the other hand, we also need to give these ladies some grace as well, okay? We have the benefit of thousands of years of church history, right? We have this expectation that Jesus is going to rise on Easter. That's what if you've been in church, that's what you've been taught from a young age, or at least culturally, you may be aware of that fact. And so, we also need to understand that this was something that is shocking. It's a new thing that God is doing through Jesus. And we also see in the message of the angels that they say this is something that must happen. It must, okay? It's a necessary condition of Jesus' mission that he die and rose again. It has to happen this way. And so their point is that this is God's plan, that Jesus and God the Father from the beginning of time said, this is the way it's going to go down, and I am going to execute this plan. It's not an optional part of Jesus' mission to die and rise again, okay? And we saw that in the garden when Jesus prayed, if this cup, let it pass away, and then, God the Father says no, right? And so this is the plan. This is what God was planning to do the whole time. And so from hundreds of years ago, the prophets told us that this is what God was going to do through Jesus. He would die and rise again. So we have these ladies, they go to the tomb, the angels give them a message, and they do what you or I would do, then they go and tell their friends what happened, right? If something crazy like this happened to you, you'd be telling others about it, right? And so they go back and then they tell the disciples and these other people that, hey, Jesus' body is gone. It's not there, and there are these two angels there. Okay? And then they say, then the apostles and these other people, they don't believe them, right? And in the ESV it says idle tales. That's a little bit of, in my mind, a mistranslation. I think really what the idea here is that they're hysterical, is an old medical term for what was happening. That these women were hallucinating or not seeing what was actually happening is what they had in mind. And so they don't believe them. They think it's crazy that this has happened. And then our guy Peter does what he always does. He's a proactive type of guy. He says, I'm going to figure this out. I'll take this by the horns. I got this, you guys. And so then he goes and he runs to the tomb and says, guess what? They were telling the truth, okay? As if they would lie about something like that, right? And so he goes and he verifies the story. And so what we see is, at this point, Jesus' body is gone, and it's been verified by these three ladies, and then also by Peter here. And so we see Jesus is gone, he's resurrected, he's come back to life, but we haven't seen him yet. So we have nobody at this point has seen Jesus. But let's pick up in verse 13 where we first see Jesus come into the picture. And so starting in verse 13, it says this, that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, what is the conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk? And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And we'll pause there. So what we see in this section is the doubt in Jesus' followers. We see the doubt in Jesus' followers. So that's what's happening here. They're doubting the fact that Jesus could come back. And what we have really here is a picture of these two guys who are headed back from Passover, okay? It's about a 2-hour walk back to their hometown here. And so they're walking back, they're talking about all these things that have just happened. It's been a crazy past week for these guys, okay? They went to Jerusalem for one of the biggest holidays in Judaism, which is the Passover. So they did that. That's how they started their week. And then their teacher, Jesus, gets arrested. He is killed. And then after all those things, he is said to have been risen from the dead by Peter and these ladies, right? So that's a crazy past few days for these guys. and they're just like, man, we need to debrief, and they're talking about what has happened. And then Jesus just rolls up with them, and they can't tell it's him. All right, they can't recognize that Jesus is the guy here coming up to talk to them. And so there's a bunch of different theories as to why they couldn't recognize Jesus. One is that his resurrected body might look slightly different than his original body. I tend to not think that way, but that's one theory. Another theory is that these men just had so much doubt that they could not comprehend how it was Jesus. I don't think it's that one either. And then the final one is that somehow Jesus is miraculously like cloaking his identity from them. And that's what I tend to think based off of how Jesus will eventually reveal himself to them. And so these guys, they do not recognize Jesus. And so they just think he's some stranger on the road who's being friendly and wanting to talk to them. And so they're talking, and then Jesus, this stranger, comes up and says, hey, what's been going on? What are you talking about? And their response to Jesus is essentially, have you been living under a rock? Okay, because this is headline news. This is the ancient equivalent of going viral, right? That's what is happening here. That it is crazy that this is happening. Every neighbor is talking to every neighbor about what has happened. And so then Jesus is talking with them, and then our guy Cleopas, when he's explaining who Jesus is, he says Jesus is a prophet. Okay? And this is an accurate statement. Okay? Jesus fulfills everything that would be required for him to be a prophet. Okay? He foretells future events that come true. He also speaks directly God's words to the people. So he does the things that a prophet would do. But this is an accurate description, but it's not a comprehensive description of Jesus' identity. Jesus is truly God and truly man. And so Cleopas here is kind of burying the lead to a degree here and not giving the full picture to this stranger or Jesus as he's describing him. And essentially, this could be for one of two reasons. He could be that Cleopas is saying, I'm interested in self-preservation. Jesus just died, and so I don't want to die too. And so I'm not going to give my full opinion of who Jesus is. I tend to not think that one. But the other option is that he could just be doubting Jesus' identity and who Jesus said he was. And I think that's what's happening here. That because of Jesus' death, he's struggling to get the full picture because of his original position about what Jesus should be doing. Okay? And what we see with Cleopas' description is that they had been hoping that Jesus was this Messiah. He was the promised one, and they had a specific vision of what that would look like. They had a specific thing in mind when that was to happen, okay? And you have to understand the context here, that the Jewish people had been oppressed for hundreds of years, okay? They had been under the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and now the Romans, okay? And that was pretty much consistent being taken over by these people for about 500 years or so. And so they're thinking, okay, this Messiah figure will be the one to free us from all this pain, suffering, and taxation that we're under. And so that's the kind of the vision that they have for this person, that he will return to the good old days when we have our own king, when we're free from this oppression, and we will also continue to have this freedom. And so that's what they're thinking here. That's their mindset. And that was the popular theology of their day within Judaism. That was the expectation. And so you can see why these guys had that. That was in their culture at the time. And so they have this messianic expectation of Jesus being a social and political figure. And so it's hard for them to get out of that mindset to see Jesus for who he truly taught he was. It's difficult to get past their assumptions about what his life should look like. And this section ends in verse 24 with a bit of what you might call dramatic irony. Okay? Luke tells us that this is Jesus. So we as the audience know this is Jesus. But Cleopas and this other guy clearly have no idea who it is. And so in verse 24, essentially Luke tells us that Cleopas says, hey, nobody has seen Jesus. But he's looking at Jesus directly, right? It gets a little bit silly, a little bit funny. You know, how could he not get that it's Jesus? He's right in front of him. And so if anybody says, hey, there's nothing humorous in the Bible, they're wrong. We see it right here. It's a little bit silly what's happening here. He's looking at Jesus, and yet he cannot see him. And so let's see how Jesus responds to Cleopas' description. Picking up in verse 25. And he, Jesus, said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going, and he acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, and while he opened up to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11, or the disciples, and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed," that's where it comes from, "and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And we'll stop there for today. And so what we see in this section is that the men see Jesus for who he truly is. They see who Jesus truly, really is. And Jesus' initial response is a rebuke here again, right? That they should have known who Jesus was and what his mission was. He said, not only did Jesus himself teach this, but Jesus says, hey, this is what the whole Old Testament points to. It's pointing forward to Jesus and his life, his death, and his resurrection. That this was the plan from the very beginning. And so the Old Testament points to him. But not only that, this is how Jesus comes into his glory. And so the word here is doxa, or that's where, if you're familiar with the term doxology, that's where it comes from, to worship, to praise, that type of idea. And so that's typically what the word doxa means. But I think in this scenario, really what it means is to enter into his majesty and his authority, which is a different way the word can be used. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. That Jesus is saying that this is how I achieve the victory. This is how I win, is by coming back from the dead. This is how I defeat my enemies, which are sin and death. It is only through becoming the better Passover lamb, through dying and coming back to life, that this can be accomplished. This is the way God has made it to be. And so he has entered into his victory, that not only he is alive, but he is ruling and reigning and authoritative. But even after Jesus explains all of this from the Old Testament to them, which would have been a cool thing to have Jesus do for you, right? But not only after that, right, he still doesn't get it. Cleopas and the other guy still don't recognize him, even after Jesus lays out all these Old Testament things that point to him. There's still a veil there, in a sense. And then finally, I think Jesus spiritually lifts the veil for them, that they finally get it, and it all clicks for them right there, that they understand who he is, what his identity is, and that this is what was supposed to have happened. That I think Jesus revealed himself to them in a supernatural way that they were able to see what was going on. And so they finally see Jesus for who he is. But then as soon as they see him, he disappears. Again, a little bit of irony there, that as soon as they have that realization and they see him for who he authentically truly is, he then disappears. And after this happens, these guys make the 2 hours and change walk back right after this. And then they go tell the disciples and the others and say, hey, we have seen Jesus. We have seen him. He is alive today. They're fired up about it. They're excited about it. And they say, this has happened and Jesus has risen indeed. And so we have here in Luke 24, Jesus coming back from the dead, appearing to these people, and them fully grasping and understanding who Jesus is in his authority and power. But so what? What do we do with this? What is the importance of Jesus' resurrection for us here and now in 2024 in Athens, Ohio? And I have I have 3 questions here for us today, okay? And as we think about these three questions, I don't want these to just be something to throw away of like, oh, those are kind of nice questions. But I want these to be something that you think about, you ponder. Perhaps if you're going home with your family or something, you talk about it in the car, you talk about it with the friend that brought you. Actually engage and think about these things and talk about them to one another. Because I think these are important questions that we all understand. And so with all that being said, the first question is, do you see who Jesus really is? Do you see him for who he truly is? Or do you just have a partial picture like Cleopas kind of presented? He just presented Jesus as prophet, not the full picture of who he is. And there was doubt of who Jesus was and his identity and the plan that God had for him. Right? And so we see that with almost all the figures, right? The women, they didn't quite fully understand who Jesus was and what he was supposed to do. We see that with the disciples, and then we see that with the men on the road. And then finally, supernaturally, Jesus says, boom, this is who I am. And they see the full picture. They have this partial spiritual blindness to who Jesus is. And then it is revealed, like the man in the beginning of the video, they have this experience where, boom, they finally capture the full image. They didn't realize what they were missing the whole time. And they see Jesus' power and authority and his glory and his resurrection. Their eyes had been opened to the full picture that God had for them. And that this is the plan that God had all along. So do you see Jesus as powerful, as authoritative, as the one true king? Is that how you see Jesus? Because that's what we see in this passage, the authority, the power of Jesus over sin and death. And this is how he has completed his mission through suffering and raising again from the dead. This is the Jesus that we see in Luke 24. He's not just a prophet. He's not just a guy with nice teaching. That's not the view of Jesus that we can accept. Because Jesus claims so much more than that. He claims to be God. He claims to be the only way to heaven. And so we must interact with that and who Jesus says that he is. So do you see Jesus for who he truly is? And building off that, do you submit to Jesus for who he really is? Do you submit to him? Okay, so we need to see Jesus for who he truly is, and then we also need to submit to Jesus, okay? And submitting isn't really a fun word, okay? We don't like to do that. I don't know if you're like me, but if somebody tells me to do something, I tend to automatically think of the opposite thing that person tells me to do, okay? I can tell there's probably a few people who are like me in that way, all right? And so that's where my natural response is, okay? And that's just sin in me, and that's things I need to work on, right? And, that is why submission is hard, because that's our natural tendency to want our own way. But what Jesus says is that his way is better, that being in his kingdom is a better way. Rather than living in our own kingdom, which ultimately will end in destruction and basically injuring ourselves spiritually, then we can have a better way in him and his kingdom. That we're all naturally outside of the kingdom and we need somebody to bring us into the kingdom. And so Jesus, in one sense, is exclusive because he says that the only way to get into the kingdom is through him, through having faith in Jesus. And so if you're here and you're outside the kingdom, you need to follow Jesus, trust in him, submit to him, live a life after him. Not that earns it, but as a result of our faith, we then pursue Jesus, okay? That's what we need to do. We need to start submitting. And really to start submitting, I would say, if you're still struggling with submitting to Jesus and seeing him for who he is, pray about it. Seek God in that moment and say, hey, Jesus, I want to see you for who you truly are because I'm struggling to see that. I want to see you as authoritative, as the king. And maybe, you're struggling with submitting to Jesus in an area of your life and you say, hey, I want to give this over to you. Help me with that. And that's a great step to starting this process of submitting to Jesus, because this is regular in the Christian life. None of us have arrived. We're all continually handing things over to our King, Jesus. And this really stems from the idea that Jesus is also inclusive. So the good news is that it's not just exclusive, but it's also inclusive. So the gospel says that, hey, everyone is naturally outside of the kingdom, but guess what? Jesus has made a way for you to go inside the kingdom, and you don't have to do anything to earn it. You just have to have faith in me. You have to trust in me and continually just do that. Trust in Jesus and what he has done in his life, death, and resurrection. And that this is a free access for us to the kingdom. So the gospel is one, exclusive. You're either inside the kingdom or outside the kingdom, but also it is free access for anyone interested in joining in the kingdom. And so this is what we see, that Jesus demands submission from us to follow him, that there are things that are going to be uncomfortable, difficult to give up for us. Everyone has something like that. But Jesus calls us to a better way, and not some arbitrary way, but a better way, because he knows how the world was designed because he made it, and he wants a better way for us. And so we ask, do you submit to Jesus for who he really is? And some of us here today might be really doubtful of the reality of Jesus' resurrection. Some of us might be struggling with, hey, that sounds nice, it sounds kind of cool, but I don't know that I can trust what these guys say about Jesus and the resurrection. And I just have something to think about if that's where you're at. If you're struggling with doubting Jesus' resurrection and whether it really happened, this is just a quote to kind of think about and to ponder these things. All right. This is from a guy named Chuck Colson. And Chuck Colson was one of the guys involved in the Watergate scandal with President Nixon. Okay. And he went to jail for his involvement in Watergate and for some other things that he did as well. And eventually he became a Christian and started a prison ministry. And this is what he says about the resurrection. He says, "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed the truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it were true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." And so that's just something to think about, okay? It's not ipso facto, this is true for our philosophy people out there, but it is saying that this is something reasonable that we should think about, okay? Why would they endure all this pain and suffering for a lie when they could have just taken a beating and then go back to their families, right? That would be another option for them. But they chose to do this because they believed it was true. They actually experienced it, and they knew it to be true. They saw the resurrected Jesus, and they knew that they could trust in him, that he had a better way for them. So do you submit to Jesus for who he really is? And finally, our third question, do you rest in who Jesus is and what he has done? Do you rest in who Jesus is and what he has done? So if you've already started this pattern of submitting to Jesus, the one true King, do you rest in him? Because the reality is that Jesus has defeated sin and death. So if we have faith in him, we are made right with God. And then we have an eternity, a future to look forward to. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, the thief on the cross, right? Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That's something he had to look forward to in suffering and difficult times. And what Jesus' victory does for us as the one true King, it means that no matter what is going on in the here and now, we can rest in Jesus and the reality of what he's done. That no matter how difficult or painful this time is for us, if we are in Christ, if we have faith in him, if we're submitting to Jesus, then it's all going to be all right in the end of days. I was just thinking, as things go towards the election in November, right? We're talking politics, so get uncomfortable. This election's coming up in November, okay? And so I'm sure you all got political ads already on YouTube or whatever. I know I have. And, as we go into this season, I just want to ask the question, are you focused more on what's going to happen politically, or are you focused more on your relationship with God? Okay? I know that's a difficult question, but do you spend more time thinking about what's going to happen in the election and things like that than what your relationship with God looks like? And realizing that you can trust in Jesus, that no matter who wins, that Jesus is still on the throne, that he is still king of the universe. And we can rest in that fact. We can rest that no matter what happens, maybe you'll be really bummed out by who wins. Okay, I don't know. But then, no matter what that situation is, we can say, hey, at the end of days, it's going to be okay because my King Jesus has already won the victory. And as Paul says, to live is Christ and to die is gain. That, even if we die in this life, probably the worst thing many of us could think about, it's only an upgrade for us because we get to spend that eternity with the one true King. So do you rest in what Jesus has done? So just as we wrap things up here, I just want to ask, do you see Jesus for who he truly is? Have you asked Jesus to show himself to you? Do you have that relationship with him as the true King? Do you submit to him? Is this a regular pattern in your life of seeking after Jesus and seeking to live the way that he designed us to be and submit to him more and more every day? And then finally, do you rest in King Jesus that no matter what happens in the here and now, we know that things will be all right because our one true King is on the throne? Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you that your resurrection seals the victory, that you show us that you have won in your resurrection, Lord, that you didn't stay dead, but you came out of the grave and you are truly risen. And I just pray here today, if there's anyone struggling with, man, I want to see who Jesus truly is, and I'm struggling with that. I pray that, you would show yourself to them and they would see the reality of who you are. Like the man with the colorblind glasses, that you see the full picture of Jesus in a new way, and that you would come to know Jesus in a saving way as well, Lord. We pray that as we go out of here, we would continue to live a life of submitting to you, trusting you, knowing that your way is better than our way, and that we live in the kingdom as followers of you. And finally, as we go out of here, no matter what happens, I pray that we would rest in you as the one true King, that we would be okay, that we would not focus on all these things of this world and get caught up in civilian pursuits, but we would get caught up in you and you as King, Lord, that would be our focus for all of our lives. And we just lift up these things to you, King Jesus. Amen. All right, go ahead and stand up and we'll sing these last two songs.